Welcome to another episode of What's Ken Making. This one's going to be a little bit different because I have something special for you guys today. As I was tearing down the Commodore 64 Ultimate for my recent video, I flipped over the main board and saw the list of original Commodore engineers. And to my surprise, I recognized one of the names, Dave Ziembicki. Now, I didn't know Dave Ziembicki, the Commodore engineer, but I actually worked with his son, Dave Ziembicki Jr., at Microsoft for a number of years. So I immediately gave Dave Jr. a call and said, "Hey, do you know this guy?" And he said, "Yes, that's my father." So Dave talked to his dad, and Dave Sr. was more than happy to sit down with me and talk about some of his time at Commodore and beyond. So what you're going to see in the next 45 minutes or so is my discussion with both Dave Ziembicki Sr. and Dave Ziembicki Jr. And then towards the end, about 45 minutes in, we're going to bring in a couple of special guests that you may recognize.
So hi, I'm Dave Ziembicki Jr., and then my father is here, who is one of the original engineers on the Commodore 64 project.
And I'm Dave Ziembicki Sr. Again, was lucky enough to be at Commodore at the time that the project came up, and it was an interesting time back then.
Really appreciate having you both here. So thanks for taking the time out of your schedule. What was it like growing up with your dad working for Commodore in the early years?
Yeah, I was pretty fortunate, from, I don't know, age 4 onward, I guess. The basement was always filled with, VIC-20 and Commodore 64 prototypes and early release things. So for a very young kid who was, just getting interested in computers, such as they were at the time, it was pretty cool having all that stuff. And then later on being able to see the whole, manufacturing process and everything that goes along with it. So, essentially, I guess, kind of born into the industry because, my whole career has been in computers and technology ever since.
Dave Sr., you're a well-respected engineer in the industry. Obviously, the system that you built, that you were a part of, has really done a long way to set the benchmark for home computing in the early years. And it's a legacy that I'm sure at some, you've had to have reflected on this at some point in the past and said, that work early on just has this lasting rippling effect.
It does. It's amazing how many people still remember it. Even to this day, I have people reaching out saying, "Was that you? That was working on that back then?" And it's like, well, yeah, 45 years ago, it was me. So.
45 years is a little bit of time. So this was back in the early 80s when you started with Commodore?
Right. So the way it started was, Charlie Winterbowl, Al Charpentier were at MOS Technology, ahead of any of the computer things they did with the Commodore 64, or even the VIC-20. They were working on a project to improve how they test semiconductors. So they needed some prototyping work done, and they found me through my brother. My younger brother worked at Commodore, or worked at MOS when he was in college at Penn State. So he was off back to college, and they needed somebody to help them with prototyping, what they were working on for chip testing, and that's how I got hooked up with them. So once the ball started rolling and they made their pitch to Jack Tramiel, and they decided to move engineering from the West Coast to the East Coast, they needed to bring some people on, and I guess I was one of the first ones that they thought of, since I was already doing work with them anyway.
So this move from West Coast to East Coast with engineering, this was a couple of years after because MOS was acquired in the late 70s by Commodore, right?
Yeah, and that was this, the semiconductor arm that Commodore had. When you look at it over the decades, you see companies go from outsourcing everything to trying to do vertical integration. You can see it in the car industry as well as in the electronics and the computer industry.
Mm-hmm.
So luckily for Commodore, they were vertically integrated. They had the chip fab. They were actually producing parts for their competitors. So they were producing parts for Atari, so and others. So that was a big advantage that Commodore had, was the ability to do their own chips, design their own chips, and produce them.
Yeah, the 6502 itself was a landmark CPU
Yeah,
that I think so many systems used. So I know you guys had your you're embedded in a lot of different platforms at the time.
correct,
Um,
correct.
yeah. So this was in the early 80s when you joined Moss. Was that 82, 83, somewhere around there?
No, before that, so I
Okay.
guess reading the notes, I believe the CES show was early '82, if I remember right. I have a hard time tracking that down,
Okay.
where the 64 was actually displayed at the show. So it was probably 80, 80, 81, when I joined. I wasn't there all that long. So
Okay. So you joined shortly before the CES show and the mission to go create the next VIC-20.
yeah, well,
Okay.
back then, Commodore's goal was they had other projects they were working on at the time. So they were going to do a subsequent version of the Commodore PET called the
Mm.
Color PET. They had a custom designed case for that made it much more streamlined. And that was one of the things I believe they wanted to show at CES, but it wasn't going to be ready in time, which really
Oh,
drove the need for the 64 to get done and get out there. So
wow. Were there
so
any
again,
prototypes?
when they did that move for engineering, obviously you're taking you need to build a product team very quickly, and Charlie and Al really went out and hired a lot of different engineering people so that they could address all of those different projects simultaneously.
Mm. Okay, so you guys were chunked up into different efforts. So there was someone working on the color pet. You were assigned to this quick, quickly
Well,
engineered
this one came up
C64. Yeah.
very late in the year, so
Hmm.
there was discussion about doing a subsequent product to the VIC-20, but it really didn't have the push until just before Thanksgiving that year, and it was an accelerated project to say the least.
There's there's a lot of lore around this.
Yeah,
So there, I don't know if you're familiar with it. There's a book series by a gentleman named Brian Bagnall that focused on Commodore, really the entire lifespan of Commodore, and even into the Amiga years.
interesting. No, I haven't seen that. I'll have to look for that.
Yep, I could send you a link to the book. I have an ebook version of it. But the early years and some of your work is discussed in there. You're brought up a couple of times as part of that history. And based on the first book, which it's called Commodore: The Early Years. Um, Brian tells the story of the CES incident, and what he says is Jack made the decision in early November, like right before Thanksgiving, to move
Right.
forward with this, and that you guys had the CES show was in January of '82, so you guys were put together very quickly in a very condensed timeline.
That's correct. And again, what they did is they pulled a handful of us in, just before Thanksgiving and said, this is what we want to do. And it wasn't just the C64 that we worked on. They wanted the 64, they wanted an education targeted unit, and then they wanted a game machine. So we actually did 3 different prototypes at the same time, 64 being the main one that they wanted to push. The game machine was 16K. I don't remember how much was or I'm sorry, the educational one was 16K, and the game machine was intended to be very inexpensive and really just focus on the power of the chipset that they had developed. So it wasn't just build 10 or 20 prototypes of one, it's build 10 or 20 prototypes of 3. 2 of the 3 used the VIC-20 case. The third one used another designed case made out of, at the time, sheet metal. So 3 efforts going on at the same time.
I assume the game console was the one that used the custom enclosure.
It did. I mean, and
Yeah.
again, it wasn't going to be the final
Mhm.
unit. They just wanted to demonstrate the performance and what they could do, for a cost-effective unit. The other two never really came out. The 64, stole the limelight and off it went. So
And did you show all three of those at the CES show?
yes, yeah, we
Okay.
did. We did.
There's this story in Brian Bagnall's book where he talks about how the Atari folks were coming to your booth at CES with their jaws dropped. Is that true? Do you remember any of that?
I actually remember the Apple guys coming to the booth and
Apple.
their jaws dropping. So Steve Jobs and Wozniak, I think, were there, and that was interesting for them because obviously they had their, the Apple II out there, and we're out there with a device that, the price points that were mentioned kind of shocked them. So it's one of the
Yeah.
advantages, again, to the vertical integration and the fact that Commodore had the semiconductor fab. They know what it costs to produce a wafer, so they could anticipate what it costs to produce DRAM. So they kind of knew where the puck was going to be, and they were willing to take the gamble on that.
Yeah, when you look through some of the historical accounts of Commodore in those years, that vertical integration was, marked as kind of a key success factor to them being able to get the price down to
Right.
make home computers so affordable. No one
Well,
else
and
was
also,
doing it at the time, right?
that's yeah, not that I can recall. I think the one of the keys to being able to turn that product as fast as we did was if you understand the processes, and you're not dependent on other people's timelines, then you can make some things happen. So the fact that there was a thing that we referred to back then as the JTI win card. So it's basically Jack wants this, so you will do it. So you will interrupt, production, for all of our other customers, so we can do a fast turn on a chip. So that allowed us to move very quickly. On the side of more of what I was involved with, the prototyping and the printed circuit and so forth. And you had cases where because they did so much work with one of the photo plotting places that would make the reticles for the chips, we could get films turned for PCB layout, in hours. And normally you'd have to fit into their schedule and wait for them to do it and, get the films. But we would get films, within a couple of hours when we pulled the trigger. I had identified some suppliers, I understood the printed circuit side of it pretty well. And it had suppliers that, you would take the films, I would leave them in the window of their building at, 11 o'clock at night. And I come back the next, 10 o'clock in the morning and I have a board. So that's the way you could turn these things fast and get the product prototyped. So then you can test the software and test the chips and all the rest. So, we did that a number of times. So if you understand the process and what does it really take to do something, it doesn't take days, it takes hours. So if you can leverage the right suppliers, that made a big difference.
I think I remember a few of those as a kid, a late night drive to a dark building, drop off a strange package and go away.
Right. Yeah, many
How
times
old-
you come pick up the product that way too. It's sitting by the window.
How old would you have been back then, Dave Jr.?
Probably 7, 8 years old, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Very neat. So and I'm a little bit I'm not quite sure I understand what your role was on the team, Dave Sr. And in some of the notes I have, it says that you were a production engineer. Can you explain, is that true? And can you explain kind of what that
Well,
what you did?
I think I was the actual title was associate engineer. I was more not so much on the chip design side as the prototyping side. Had a lot of experience with circuit board design. So we had a circuit board designer that actually did the layout of the boards. Back then it was, it wasn't done on CAD. You had to manually run all the circuits. You'd get the layout and you'd make sure that all the points connected correctly. So a lot of manual checking back in those days.
And
So
they're
that
only
plus sourcing the components, knowing where to get the different parts that we'd have to do to build it. making sure you had what you needed, and you build the prototype and start testing.
And back then they were all only two-sided boards, right?
Right. Two-sided
So
boards.
everything, yeah. So probably some times where you had to be very creative, especially on a system as dense as the C64 was.
Yes. Yeah. Well, again, you didn't have surface mount back then. It was leaded devices, so it was interesting times. Certainly when you move forward to the Amiga days, you're multi-layer and you've got a lot of ability to build a lot more dense designs.
Was the circuit board layout on the light table? Was that like in all the tape? And so it'd be like this huge light table and then thin black tape laying out like all the different directions that the connections were going to go.
Right. And then that's what you would take to the guys that produce the films. They used to call it photo plotting, not laser plotting, so that was all part of it. Making sure that the connection, it was actually plated through, so you have a connection from the top to the bottom, and you're not crossing lines that are going to short out. A lot of manual effort back then.
Yeah, I think a lot of enthusiasts these days that resurrect some of these old C64s and other hardware of that era can attest to some of the challenges. Even, you'd be surprised. I don't know if you've caught up on any of this and kind of the content creator space, but there are a lot of people that are doing a lot of in-depth work on C64 in particular, but a lot of old systems to repair them and all sorts of interesting, discoveries and things that they found in doing that.
Yeah. No, I haven't really paid attention to it. I probably should have. The other thing that got interesting when you were doing things like this, if you get past the prototyping stage, some of the challenges were you have to meet FCC requirements. So that was another thing that, you had long runs of high frequency communications going on the board. So the shielding and, that surround the processors, the video processors and so forth, that was a challenge too.
Yeah, I thought I had heard at one point, and I don't have any notes on this, so I can't refresh my memory. I'm not sure if my memory is accurate here, but was the shielding in something that was done after the fact, after FCCC was failed? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. First goal, make it work. Show it at the show. Decide that it's worth pursuing. Then productize it after that. So that the next exercise after we got back from the show was, all right, so now we've got to create the documentation so it can go into production. So document all the components you're using. And again, you didn't have the computer systems that you do now. You didn't have Excel, so you go back and then, okay, it's not Excel, it's Lotus 123. No, you didn't have that either. You go back to VisiCalc, so you're going back several iterations of the tools that were out there. You didn't have PCs to put it all in either. So
it's labor of love, very manual.
Yeah.
So who else was on the C60? Because was it the same team that worked on the C64, the education prototype, and the game console? You and a couple of other people,
there was a handful of us. So Charlie Winterbull obviously was, leading the team. Al Charpentier leading the team on the chip side as well. Bob Yanis, Bob Russell. I was there, and there's probably one or two others.
Okay. Yeah,
there's a handful.
There's a quote that I have. I don't think I have it in front of me from I think Bob Russell, where he talks about how it was just him, Bob Yanis, and you that were doing most of the work on the prototype for CES.
Yeah, that's true.
When the system went from prototype, the C64 went from prototype into production, were there a lot of changes to the design?
Yeah, there were some changes to try and make it easier to build on the production side. We probably optimized the component selection, going away from what you could find to what actually worked the best. We also wanted to try and, again, engineering had just moved to the East Coast, wasn't familiar with the production process that Commodore had in the Far East and other places. So we had to match up with what they could get component-wise and where they could get it. So we would we would produce, bills of material that had all the specs for all the different components. We actually set up a prototype line back in their Westchester facility. They bought a greeting card company, a 600,000 square foot building in Westchester, Pennsylvania. And that was going to be where production occurred, at least some of it. And it was an interesting thing there too. So we needed to get a pilot production line set up so that we could produce samples that they could take to the factories and build them there. And getting space in that factory while they were still negotiating the lease or the purchase of the building was challenging. They only had limited access. So.
Interesting. So, so the prototype, you called it a pilot production line. So this was specifically for building the early versions of the prototypes that would then be sent somewhere else to be fabbed, or are those done in-house?
No, they were basically done because you needed more units to show at trade shows and take to distributors and ahead of the actual full-blown production. You wanted to build some to identify any challenges you have in mass production. You also wanted to get the units built that were going to go through the FCC testing and the approval process. Nailed down that the power supply has enough power and a lot of those things that you don't want to find out the hard way after you've built 100,000 of them. So that was a line that we set up. We had hired people that were more production oriented than prototype oriented to see how they built them and see where the problems were going to be.
Speaking of power supplies, there's been some history with kind of plugging in a original C64 power supply into the wall these days, 40 years later, and some challenges with it overvolting and killing chips. Do you remember any PSU issues back in the day when you were first going through that?
We didn't back then. Again, it was we wanted to make sure we had the right amount, the right voltages and the right amount of capacity on the power supplies. Certainly when we were building the prototypes, we weren't focused on. We wanted to make sure we had more than enough power and regulation. Once it went into production, it became a challenge. I can remember a case where one supplier delivered something that didn't meet the spec, and that was an issue. And we just had to go back and make sure that we got the vendor to deliver the product that was going to be reliable. That comes back to the specs too. You have to write the specs in such a way that they can't take advantage of the spec you wrote.
Yeah, and a lot of challenges these days are the fact that a lot of these components are decades old at this point. And so which is funny because there's an ongoing discussion. I won't call it a debate, but a discussion in the kind of electronics engineering community around some of the older capacitors and how much more stable they are than some of the new ones, being manufactured, and people ripping out the old ones, putting in replacements, and they're not of the same quality. So it's interesting to see the wear on components over many decades.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, who would think they'd still be using them, 45 years later? So 40 years later.
There are a lot of people that are very much enthusiastic about your work. The original prototype you took to CES, do you know whatever happened to that? Is that in someone's house in an attic somewhere?
I don't know. I think we took, the goal was to build 15 or 20 of each. We probably took 6 or 7 of each. So we had enough that if one blew up, we could put another one in its place, 1 or 2. But I really don't know where they all ended up. I probably had one, and it probably got shuffled out over the years, in the various moves that we had. So probably would have been worth keeping.
Yeah, there's if you look at prices for C64s, really any kind of vintage retro computer these days, they're going for a premium for sure. But yeah, that would have been a museum piece, really.
Yeah, well, I have one. It's in my collection. It's not a new one. It's a newer one that came out of normal production several years later. So,
Do you still use it? You
There's
fire
one
it
in
up?
the Commodore. I think there is one in the Smithsonian, Commodore
Yeah,
64. I know there is at the Franklin Institute in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
I haven't used it lately. Again, it's there. I've got the monitor, I've got the floppy drive, so I've got the bits and pieces, but haven't used it lately.
What do you, so let's say you were to go and fire it up these days, what would be your go-to? Would you go to a game, or what would be your
Most
use
likely a
case?
game. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a bunch of the games. Yeah, it's just interesting how much things have changed over the years.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of people in the demo scenes that have really stretched the hardware limitations of the C64. Were you guys aware of any of that early on in the 80s when the scene was just up and coming and active in that space?
Not too much. I mean, we saw that people were doing all kinds of different things. One of the things that we developed, or I developed independently, was an EEPROM programmer, so you could plug it into the 64 and burn EEPROMs. If you had a game you wanted to share with your friends, so you could do all kinds of things. When you think about it, though, 64K of memory. It's compared to what you have in your Apple Watch these days, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean back then 64K was quite a lot for sure.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So what was it like working with Jack? I mean, there's a lot of infamous stories of Jack Tramiel and various situations. He was on the West Coast, right? So you guys were separated from that side of Commodore?
He was, and I probably only met him a couple of times, so I really didn't interact with him much. But I did use his name frequently to get purchase orders cut and knock down a few barriers. So it worked well. It was probably better that he wasn't in the building. They couldn't have double checked everything we were doing. So
What was there? But I know your time at Commodore kind of came up in the mid 80s. You moved off, but before you left Commodore, was there any project that you really wanted to take on? Anything you wanted to do that hadn't happened that you wish did back then?
Not while I was there. Obviously Charlie, Al, and Bob moved on after the Commodore 64 more or less was released. And I followed them to what was called Peripheral Visions originally, and it turned into Ensoniq. So I wasn't too far behind them after they left.
So what was the goal of Peripheral Visions? Was it to build the next computer?
The original project was to make an attachment for the Atari VCS game console to turn it into a computer. So that was the original project.
Okay.
And it went pretty well. But then certainly Bob Yanis was into the audio side of things, and that led us to Ensoniq when we were doing digital samplers and synthesizers and digital pianos. So yeah, kind of did the same thing to the music industry that they did on the computer side with the Commodore 64.
Wasn't that the first one that had like the pressure sensitive keys or something like that? The synthesizers, at least in that price range.
Yeah, the main thing on the synthesizers, or the original product was the Ensoniq Mirage, which is a digital sampler, and that was to compete against the Kurzweil equivalent, and we came in at 1/5 the price or something like that. So it was, again, knowing what you could do with the digital technology, and certainly Bob's and Al's experience with chip design really helped drive that industry as well.
So you guys at Ensoniq, you were manufacturing your own synth chips. They were based on the SID design, right? Early on.
I don't know that it was the SID as much as it was, Bob's ability to design the chip. I think it would have been the next generation. He'd be the best one to ask about that.
Okay,
So,
yeah, just curious. Yeah. Did you work with Moss to produce the chips for your devices at Ensoniq?
I don't believe so.
So when you left Commodore, you spent a little bit of time at Peripheral Vision. Peripheral Vision was rebranded as Ensoniq, right? Or was there a new company
Yeah.
formed?
No,
Okay.
it was just rebranded. Yeah.
Okay. And were you passionate about the synthesizer world, or was this, just another gig for you?
No, well, it's interesting being able to make a difference in an industry, and see a paradigm shift. That was the fun part. Always like the challenge of, building something new, and, basically ending up with a better product at the end of it. So than what was there before.
What happened to the Atari keyboard? So did that turn into the 400 or one of the early Atari computers?
No, again, the 400 and the 800 were out there as we were working on the 64, actually. So we did
Okay.
see those. In this case, it was what can we do for people that have an Atari, game console, where you slam a cartridge in and you play a game. Can you actually take that platform and make an attachment that would turn it into a low-cost personal computer? And the answer was yes, but at the end of the day, I think they determined it wasn't going to be cost effective or compete against the Commodore 64. So I believe that's why it really never made it to full production.
Yeah, that's right. Because I guess the 400 and 800 were the late 70s was around the time that those came out. Kind of getting my timeline straight now. Okay. Dave Jr., did you get a chance to play with any of this when your dad brought stuff home?
All along the way, we had all the games. I remember the Commodore 64 cartridges, and then the EEPROM. So we had a whole drawer full of an EEPROM for every game. So it's a pretty dense way to store a lot of games, which was nice. You just pick a chip out, pop it in there, and off you go. But then eventually, I don't remember the path that kind of led into the Amiga world, but then that was a couple of years later. But then that's where a lot of that extensibility kind of came back in, with the interchangeable processor cards and hard disk controllers just coming out and all that stuff.
Yeah,
that was the follow-on. So a company that I founded, along with a couple of others, Great Valley Products, that made the hard disk controllers and processor accelerators for the Amiga back then. So
your story didn't end after Ensoniq. You went on to found Great Valley Products, and you were primarily working in the Amiga space then.
We were. I mean, Gerard Bucas and Jeff Boyer as well. So they were both at Commodore at the time. I had already been gone for a number of years. But the opening was Commodore didn't really go after having a hard drive for the Amiga, which you really need it. And we really took advantage of an opening in the space to do that.
Yeah, were there a lot of other competitors operating in that space at that time?
Not really.
Yeah. So did you? How long did you stay with Great Valley Products and working on hardware for the Amiga?
Well, probably until 93, somewhere in there.
Okay.
So,
did you go off and stay in this same industry, or were you fed up at this point, wanting to do something different?
Again, companies get to a stage. In my case, I'm kind of a startup guy, and always have been. Even back when it was Commodore, effectively we were a startup in building the 64 within the company. But I've continued down that path. I guess what I've done for the last 25 years is wireless internet, so Wi-Fi. So it's hard to say that that's been going on for 25 years, but that's kind of where I landed. So
there's a story in that book I was mentioning earlier, some of the Commodore historical accounts. There's a story that, or a side note, I should say, that you had invented a vehicle backup camera early on, or at least not a backup camera, a collision sensor.
Yeah, blind spot detection. Yeah.
Okay.
We did that too. So we're kind of ahead of the curve there. we had it. The intention was we had run into one of the metal suppliers that we had for the Ensoniq products was in Minnesota, and they had an insurance agent who sold a lot of commercial insurance for trucking. And he's like, boy, it'd be great if trucks didn't run into cars. And it's like, well, we can use sonar to determine there's a vehicle next to you, and you could measure, so you're only looking one lane over. So we developed that product that you could put onto a tractor trailer or somebody pulling a trailer, and sense there was a vehicle in the lane next to them. So once again, it's commonplace now. But back in the the 80s, it wasn't. So
yeah, that was pretty sure that was 10 or 15 years before I ever saw or heard that on any actual vehicle. So yeah, it was interesting. And it was sonar based, so that was kind of interesting too.
There were some challenges with that. The sensors that were available. We weren't creating anything custom. We had to use components that were readily available, and there's harmonics that come into play. So the tractor trailer tires throw off a harmonic that made it challenging to be able to differentiate. And right then at that time, digital signal processors were just getting out there, so you could use a DSP to filter that out. But once again, a product that didn't make it off the prototyping. We had units, we had them on trucks, but never made it the rest of the way.
Well, I mean, your entire career, it sounds like, is a theme of ahead of its time throughout the whole process.
Seems to be, unfortunately. Lucked out a few times, so I can't complain.
Was there anything else interesting that you did around that time period that never saw the light of day that you're really proud of?
One of the things that we worked on after Great Valley Products was quick turn chip packaging. So if you want to take a chip and you want to test it, you have to get it from the wafer into a package that you can test it. So had a company that would do quick turn chip packaging. One of the other products that it allows you to do is you could, I guess back in the early to mid 90s, hard disk drives had problems with shock, or physical shock, where if they get bumped, you could, the head would hit the disk and it would ruin the drive. So a company was making accelerometers that would be able to sense that, and we did a lot of the production on that on those devices using our chip packaging process. So that worked out pretty well too.
And chip manufacturing has come such a long way since then.
Yeah.
4-inch
wafers up to 12-inch wafers. Transistor density is just incredible. So.
Yeah, and they had a line of all that equipment in a small, very small clean room. Actually, not too far from where MOS was, right?
Oh, right. So, right.
Yeah, I remember being there one summer and working on a wire bonding machine. It's like the most frustrating job ever, because that wire would break like every 2 seconds, and then it would take 20 minutes to feed it back through.
Yeah, that's super tiny bonds, very tiny wires. Yeah, a lot to go wrong.
Yeah. And we did some prototyping. We had the wire bonding systems. They were state of the art at the time. We actually understand that we actually packaged the first Pentium chip for Intel prototype. The company that built the wire bonders didn't want to take the chance of doing it themselves, so they offloaded it to us to take the risk. So,
well, I'm going to pivot, if you don't mind. I want to bring a couple of folks into the call here, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
So admitting them into the meeting now. So
hey guys.
Hey guys.
It's good to see you both. So we have Perry Fractic and Mark Bilodeau. So forgive me if I butchered your name, Mark.
No, you got it.
So Dave Sr., are you aware that Commodore was recently repurchased and restarted as a modern Commodore company?
I'm aware, but I haven't followed it closely. So I did see some press, and some of the people that still contact me indicated that was happening. So I'm just kind of curious, the direction and where that's going to go. So
Well,
So am I. So am I, Dave.
Yeah.
Just to introduce myself. So, Periphractic, CEO and President, and Chief Joystick Waggler, as we say, of Commodore.
I'm Mark, the CTO.
So we had the opportunity around last April, May, to acquire the whole of the Commodore brand. And I grew up with the Commodore 64, Amiga, the whole thing. And it was something that felt like it was a duty that I just couldn't say no to, that opportunity being on the table. I was very lucky through having a YouTube channel, just like Ken. Nice to see you, Ken, as well. To have already been ingrained in the Commodore community for about 8 years. And I think people knew me pretty well for mainly doing Commodore videos. So there was just this wonderful, synchronicity and opportunity to just, get this brand that I loved, that meant so much to me, out of the gutter as it had been lying kind of not particularly well treated for 31 years, and do something really magical based on some of the videos that I'd made. So, for example, we've released the Commodore 64 Ultimate, which is kind of based on projects that I've done using community parts where someone had made new cases, someone had made new keyboards, new motherboards. And the opportunity was there to put it all together into just a fantastic conglomeration of YouTubers and tech wizards. So I have a fantastic team. We have actually about 45 team members now through operations, technology, marketing, finance. Mark is one of our wizards, and as CTO is building some really exciting things in the background. And we're in this really interesting transition period now where we've just come out of delivering all the products over Christmas, and we're just about to deliver the final units from the pre-order of this, over 20,000 units.
Wow.
And we're working on probably 6 or 7 major products, none of which I'm able to talk about, which I wish I could. But we're in this kind of public lull, but doing so much behind the scenes, and it's just a really exciting time. And just want to wrap this kind of intro up by saying thank you to you, David, I should say, for giving us, the company and the product that has allowed us to do this. We put your name, I don't know if you know this, but we put your name under the motherboard of the product. So if I unplug it so it doesn't blind us, this is a tribute to all the people that helped make the product. And just there under that LED, I think you'll see your name.
Yes.
We did try and track you down.
That. Yeah.
No, absolutely. We did try and track you down to get your autograph, but we looked high and low and we couldn't find you anywhere. So maybe there's an opportunity to get your autograph added to future versions. And just to finish by saying, as thanks, obviously, for all your work with Commodore and making this machine and other ones, we'd love to send you a founder's edition as soon as we get some in stock. This is the gold one with 24 karat gold badge there and PVD keycaps and all of that stuff. So maybe we can get your details from Ken and get you one of those.
Oh, I'd appreciate that. It's good that it's being remembered. It's good that it's still being promoted. I think it was important at the time, and it sounds like you're going to really drive it forward, which is excellent.
I appreciate that. I think, when you really love something, and I think Commodore is to many of us in the community like a family member, it's something you grew up with, right? It's like a pet or a sister or well, no pun intended, pet.
Right.
So you can't help but drive it from a place of love, and that, it means something important. It's not something that's a business in my mind or a project. This is basically what I feel like I was destined to do. So I think if you do it that way, and if it comes from a true place, you can't really fail. So that's my main job, is make sure this never becomes a bankrupt Commodore again.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is how all this came about. Is I'm doing in the middle of a teardown video on their Commodore 64 Ultimate product, Dave.
And when I was examining the motherboard, when I do a teardown, I typically do an in-depth chip analysis, signal tracing, that kind of thing, really dig in. And when I pulled out the main board and flipped it over, I saw your name. And I said, wait a second. Dave Ziembicki is a very unique name. And I know a guy named Dave Ziembicki. So I figured there was probably some relationship. So the first thing I did was to, ping your son, Dave Jr., and say, hey, I think this might be someone you know.
Right.
So
yeah, I was about 7 years old at that time, so wouldn't have been able to be a Commodore 64 designer myself, but it's certainly a consumer.
Yeah.
Probably an influence as well, I would imagine, in some intangible way in the unit.
Yeah. He
Yeah,
probably wondered why I wasn't around much between Thanksgiving and and New Year's that year. So
For sure.
That was the famous scramble, right, to get the prototypes done or the chips done.
a lot of pieces fell in place, and it worked out really well.
You can say that again. And I have to doubly thank you because I had a GVP A530 Turbo on my Amiga 500.
There you go. Yep.
And if I'm not mistaken, you were vice president and co-founder.
Yes, that's correct, of GVP.
I love that product so much. I can't. It seems so strange to be a grown adult talking about how much you loved a hard drive, but the way that thing souped up my Amiga little A500 was something else, and I've always regretted selling it. I found the actual advert, the classified ad where I sold it in 1994. And I was like, damn it, man, why did you sell it? That was part of your teenage years.
Right.
But yeah, thank you for that.
That was when the quantum 20 megabyte and 40 megabyte hard drives were the big deal, especially if
Wow.
40 megabyte.
Incredible power. I mean, who could imagine anything more than 40 megabytes?
Yeah, back then, exactly.
Yeah.
At hundreds of dollars too.
Hundreds, yeah.
Yes.
So Dave, what I would love to ask you as well, I kind of sowed the seed mentioning that we are working on several products. We do have a number of alumni and your ex-colleagues from Commodore who are actively working on things that we can't talk about right now. But you'll see all their names on our team page at commodore.net. And if you're open to it, I would love to, offline, outside of this meeting, pick your brains, maybe see if you wanted to advise on a product that might interest you, and just have that conversation as well, and see if you're interested in being one of our ex-Commodore alumni advisors.
Happy to talk about it. I'm not sure what I can bring to the party after all these years, but certainly worth a discussion. I'm really interested in what you're doing.
All right.
Cool.
Nice.
Actually, Leonard sent us finally sent us his review of the Founders Edition yesterday. I got a text from him, and he just said it looks absolutely fantastic. He's got it set up on his, big widescreen TV in the correct aspect ratio, of course, 4:3. But it was quite a moment. I shared it with the whole team, but it's quite a moment to get a text from Jack Trammell's son, actually endorsing what we've done, and he was kind enough to follow up, thanking us for everything that we've done. And I think, we thank him endlessly for him and his father's contribution, just as we thank you. But it is rather wonderful to have that go both ways and see the past reflecting the present and the future. So it's a really special time. So we'd love to chat with you about getting involved.
Sounds good.
Something I very much appreciate about what Perry and Mark and the team have done with the new brand, I think a lot of people in the community do, is you had mentioned this to me in an email, Perry, that you want to infuse as much of the original Commodore into this company as possible.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The original DNA is how I like to put it. I think that because there have been these attempts to reboot Commodore, and the critics that we had early on, I think quite fairly called out the fact, it's never going to be Commodore again. But I beg to differ, and I think if you bring enough of the original Commodore back, it's like the ship of Theseus, right? At what point does it stop being just a new company and start becoming part of the old company. And I think we've got probably 6 or 7 of the original team, but we're also piecing together hardware. There's again something I can't talk about, but we reacquired something that belonged to Commodore, something quite substantial, belonged to Commodore in the 90s, that's now back home at Commodore, and I'll be making videos and releasing products all about that. But yeah, there comes a point, I think, where nobody can deny that it is the original. It's obviously changed and upgraded, and some new leadership here and there. But we were fans of the original, so I think we were original Commodore anyway, even though I was 14, 15 at the time. So we're still here.
That's what I hear from different people all the time. It's like, I had this when I was, in high school. So, they still follow it, and they still, remember it. And, in some cases they still use it, which is great.
Yeah,
So I'm
I'll
just
agree.
lucky I was able
I'll
to,
agree, David.
Lucky I was able to play a small part in making it happen. So.
More than a small part, in my opinion. I mean, I talk to people in the community all the time and other makers, and the enthusiasm I hear from them on some of the things that we're doing is amazing. So there's so much energy that I love about what's happening right now. It's really wonderful.
I will say, Dave, that the main board on the new Commodore 64 Ultimate is nowhere near as dense as the one that you designed
right
back in the early 80s.
So. Yeah, we actually had an interesting decision to make, because obviously you designed the long board and then it moved to the short board version, and because we were using the bread bin case, the obvious thing to do was just use the short board styling, which is based on Gideon Zweitzer's Ultimate 64 motherboard, and his is based on the short board version. I actually insisted that we raise it back to long board sizing, so it fills the whole case, and you can almost kind of see the Commodore logo. It may be too bright here, but through here on a good day when it's not cloudy and you look at the right angle, you'll get the logo visible because it's right at the front of the PCB. And even the original Commodore copyright symbol, we tracked down the original font, so everything's in the same place that it was on the longboard, as much as we possibly could, although it is FPGA. So we did as much as possible to celebrate the original C64.
That's excellent.
Well, there it is. We'll get one to you anyway, so you can have a good look and unscrew it.
Excellent. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Oh, pleasure.
Yeah, just as we, I know we're at the end of our time here, and I know Perry and Mark's time is very valuable, and as well as yours, Dave's senior and junior. So, knowing that the Commodore 64 in particular, Dave, is living on from this point forward as a newly manufactured machine still, how does that make you feel? What does that say to you?
It's amazing that it survived the time, given all the other things that are out there now. I do agree that there's still a place for it, and really happy to see that it's coming back to life. It's very good.
And what's the first?
That warms our hearts.
Yeah. Yes, it does. Yes.
What's the first game you're going to play when your Founders Edition arrives from the company?
Good question. That's a good question. Yeah.
They're all on here.
Wow. Nice.
we cheated a little bit.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I know. Again, we are out of time, and don't worry about our time. But your time is precious. But just to piggyback on what you said, Dave, I think it's not just that it's the right time and people still love the machine. There is this movement towards digital minimalism and people trying to get away from tech that's gone a bit too far. Every time I open my Windows laptop, there's pop-ups and forcing me at gunpoint to update the software and social media and you name it. We've seen such a huge portion of the community who are drawn to the fact that this thing wants nothing from you.
Right.
It's there just to serve you and let you have fun. You can download games through Wi-Fi directly onto it. That's a feature we added, but there's no pop-ups, there's no social media and all of that. So it's a really interesting fact that Commodore went away in 1994, just when I think tech started to go too far and we got the first smartphones, and the internet, of course. And now we're back exactly when society wants that simplicity back. I think there's something very poetic and magical about that.
That's true. You're absolutely right.
Good. I'm glad you think so. And we'll chat more about this another time. We'll have a good talk.
Yeah,
Look forward to it.
Really appreciate all of you guys hopping on and having a chat. Dave Sr., thank you again for taking the time today, and also for all the work that you did over the years. I'll just say I've really enjoyed knowing your son and working with him for the past 15, 20 years, Dave, something like that.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep.
We're very proud of him. He's had an excellent career and done a lot of things. We couldn't be prouder.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would say that the Commodore is probably your second best creation, right? Oh boy. Okay. Well, I hope we can chat again in the future. Maybe we can. I'll help connect you with Perry and Mark here in the Commodore. I'm going to step out of it. I don't need to be anywhere in this picture.
You're very welcome either way.
Appreciate you
Nice.
guys. Very cool. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And I'll see you some point in the future, I suppose.
All right. It was a pleasure.
care.
Thank you, guys.
It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.
See ya.
Take care.
Well, I really enjoyed spending the time talking with Dave Sr. about his time at Commodore, as well as Dave Jr., and I hope you enjoyed it as well. A special thanks to the folks at Commodore for joining me for part of this video, and for their generosity towards Dave. If you like this and want to see more of this interview-style content, leave me a comment and let me know. I would definitely consider doing more of this in the future. But that's all I have for today, so I'll see you next time. But as always, until then, go make something cool.